Okay, in this class we're looking at the CPE exam, that's Cambridge Proficiency Exam. It's the hardest exam, and we're looking at a part of the use of English paper. It's a grammar paper where you have to put in the missing words, and it's really rather difficult. I think it's one of the most difficult parts of the CAE and CPE exams. And this advice you can use for the CAE exam as well as the CPE exam and even the FCE exam, but this is a harder version of both of those papers. So let's look at the first one. Ellis Island in New York, that extraordinary entrance to a new land and a new life which received, processed and dispatched millions of arriving immigrants 1892 and 1924. Okay, so all of that part between the two dashes is an afterthought, or it's an interrupting thought, let's call it, because the main sentence is Ellis Island in New York has been turned blah 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 a museum. Now, with these missing spaces, you want to think what possibilities are there. Now, I have never heard of Ellis Island. Shame on me. I don't know where it is or what it's all about. But I can see that because they're mentioning arriving immigrants, and it's a place where the immigrants were received, processed and dispatched. Clearly, this was a place which was very important many years ago, and it could be, we could say that the missing word here is in 1892 and in 1924. But that would be a little bit odd, because that would mean that this place, which processed and dispatched all the arriving immigrants, it only worked for 2 years. And I think that would be quite odd, you know, that it would be functioning in 1892 and 1924. There's quite a big space between those 2 years. So it's more likely that it was working for the whole period, for that, I don't know how many years it is, 32-year period. And if that's the case, then we need a different word here than in. And I think that probably is the case. Now, we could say from 1892 to 1924, but it doesn't say to here. So it can't be from 1892 to 1924. It's actually looking for between, and we know it's between because of the and. We do say between X and Y. We can say between 1892 and 1924. And that's why between is the correct answer, and not in and not from. From could be correct if we had to here, from 1892 to 1924. So I hope that's clear. So we want, number one, we want between, the preposition between. Let's look at number two now. Has been turned a museum. Now, a lot of you out there will already feel that this is some kind of phrasal verb that we're looking for. And if anyone would like to brush up on their phrasal verbs, just go below the video and you can click on a link where you can buy my book on phrasal verbs. And believe me, all the phrasal verbs on this paper, they are in that book, or certainly the ones on this particular section anyway. And this phrasal verb is certainly in the book. We want the phrasal verb to turn something into something. Here it's being used in passive. It has been turned into a museum. Yeah, it has been made into or turned into a museum. So you just need to know your phrasal verbs for a lot of the answers here, and they very often test phrasal verbs because they know they're difficult, and I'm sure we'll see a few more phrasal verbs in a moment, and I know that they test another one in a second. So do brush up on your phrasal verbs before you take this paper. So this is, turned into a museum for number two. And when you get verb and then a missing space, a lot of the time it's a preposition. Not always, but a lot of the time. Well, especially if you get verb and then a space and then a noun, because very often prepositions are used to set up a relationship to a noun. Okay, let's have a look at number three. We've got something lain derelict for years. Now, always pay attention to the word directly after and directly before the missing space. So it's after a full stop here, so we can't pay attention to museum, but we must pay attention to lain. And lain is what we call a past participle. It's the past participle of lay. Now that's already giving you a big clue, because there's only one missing space before it. This is probably going to be a perfect participle or a perfect gerund, but if we read further we can see that it must be a perfect participle, because we've got something lain derelict for years after its official closure, and then we've got a comma. Now I've got a lot of videos on participles and participle phrases, but if you start with the participle phrase you need a comma before the main clause. So this is already giving us clues that we've got a participle phrase at the start, and we've already got the past participle, so we need the perfect form. We want having lain derelict for years. Now if anyone wants more information about perfect participles, just type perfect participles Mr. Skype lessons into the search bar and you will find some lessons on perfect participles. And yes, they do test that kind of stuff on the CPE. It's advanced grammar, and so they test it on the advanced paper, the proficiency paper. Let's keep going. The island's huge purpose-built reception area has been restored. Okay, so they've just told us that the reception area was derelict for a long time, but now it has been restored. So notice they're talking about the changes that have happened, because this is important for the next missing gap, the next missing word. Okay, it has something, a place of pilgrimage for the descendants of the desperate people who filed through its cavernous main hall to answer questions. So here something's changed. It was derelict, but now it has been restored, so now it has become. You see, I recognise that it has been is quite tempting to write, and at a glance I can imagine that lots of people will think it has been a place of pilgrimage for the descendants of the desperate people, but that wouldn't make sense with the previous sentence. The previous sentence is telling us that things have changed. It was derelict for many years, now it has been restored, so now it has become a place of pilgrimage for the descendants of the desperate people. And the fact that we're talking about the descendants of the desperate people who filed through its cavernous main hall, it means that we're talking about how things have changed again, how things are now completely different. It is now a place of pilgrimage, so it has become a place of pilgrimage. It wasn't a place of pilgrimage back in 1892, because it wasn't a place of pilgrimage for the descendants. It was a place where the documents were processed and received and dispatched for any new immigrants. So it's only now it has become a place of pilgrimage for the descendants of the desperate people who filed through its cavernous main hall. But please recognise for number 4 that this can only be a main verb, or it's most likely to be a verb, not an infinitive, but a past participle again, because it's got to be present perfect tense. It has something, a place of pilgrimage. It has been, it has become, it has, I can't think of many other words that work here, any in fact, except for become, but been might work in a different way. I mean, it would work if we're in a different essay. But yeah, you are definitely looking for a past participle there, and it's good to be aware of these things. It will help you reach become much quicker if you recognise things like present perfect tense. Okay, so let's carry on. A place of pilgrimage for the descendants of the desperate people who filed through its cavernous main hall. Notice filed through is another phrasal verb. This is why I say they're important. Its cavernous main hall to answer questions and in the forms. Now here we've got a preposition and a noun, which is the object of the preposition. So this is most likely to be a verb, and again it's testing your phrasal verbs. So please do buy my book, there's a link to it under the video to help you with these phrasal verbs, because this one is certainly in the book as well. So what do you do with a form? Well, you can fill in a form. So we need and filled in the forms. Now make sure, if you get the verb fill, make sure you put it in past tense. Why? Because it's for the desperate people who filed through blah 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 and filled in blah, 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 blah. This is parallel structure that the writer's using. It's why it's a good piece of writing. They're using people who filed through and filled in. They're using phrasal verb and phrasal verb, verb and preposition, and it sounds very nice for that reason. But be aware when you're probably looking for a phrasal verb, it will help you find it much quicker. Okay, so filed through and filled in the forms in whatever halting English possessed. Now, clearly, this verb possessed doesn't have a subject, so we need to give the verb possessed a subject. So we need to refer to the migrants with a pronoun, and we're clearly talking about the migrants because we're talking about in whatever halting English. Halting English means imperfect English, broken English, and so we're talking about people who have moved to the country, and we need a pronoun to refer to those people, and that's why they works very well in number 6. In whatever halting English, they possessed. So you can see that looking at the parts of speech, you can see there's a verb here. You need a doer, you need a subject before the verb. Thinking about parts of speech will help you on this exam. So they possessed, it works very well. Okay, to get to Ellis Island, you take a ferry from the southernmost tip of Manhattan. Okay, that's one sentence. Then we've got, you sail past the Statue of Liberty and pull up to the dock outside the enormous entrance to that imposing reception building, comma. Now, that's already a clue, as far as I'm concerned, because clearly the main clause is starting after the comma. And that means that you've probably got a subordinate clause before the comma, because subordinate clause, comma, main clause is one of our punctuation rules. And if you're not sure about that, just type subordinate clause, Mr. Skype Lessons, into the YouTube search bar, and I'm sure you'll find some lessons on that. I consider that a very important comma rule. So that means that this subordinate clause probably starts with something that we call a subordinating conjunction. Now, it doesn't have to. It might have a 2 plus infinitive phrase, as we had at the start, to get to Ellis Island, comma. It might have a fronted adverbial phrase or a fronted adjectival phrase. But this one seems to be a whole clause, because it's you sail and you pull up. Yeah, you've got a further verb down there for you pull up, you sail, blah, 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 and pull up to the dock. So we probably need a subordinating conjunction to start this clause. And I'm glad to say there are at least 3 correct answers here, in fact 4. You could use the subordinating conjunction as you sail past, blah, 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 and pull up, or while you sail past and pull up, or even when you sail past and pull up, or even whilst you sail past and pull up. All of those subordinating conjunctions work. But notice that it is good to have a list of subordinating conjunctions in your head, because sometimes you can see that it must be a subordinate clause simply because of the comma down here, and also because of the subject, you, and verb, sail. That means you've got to have a subordinate clause, so you've got to have a subordinating conjunction at the start. Let's carry on with the main clause now. But notice they have got sail past, dock outside. They're kind of phrasal verbs. Okay, it is impossible to reflect on it must have looked to those hordes of people. Now I'm going to save number 8 for a moment, because I think it's easier to do once we've already got number 9. So it is impossible to reflect on something it must have looked. So what are we missing here? Well, it looks to me like it must be some kind of question word, because we're questioning the way in which it looked to those hordes of people. Yeah, we're not talking about looked like, by the way, and that's important, because if you see looked like, it would be what it must have looked like to those hordes of people. And so what is possible if it had written looked like here, you would have had to put what in here. But it doesn't say that, it just says looked. And so here we want how it must have looked. Notice that we want an adjective here. We're describing it, how it must have looked. It must have looked beautiful. It must have looked amazing. It must have looked fantastic. And we don't want a noun, which would be looked like, which would be what it looked like. It looked like a hotel. It looked like a museum. Yeah, but so what it must have looked like, but how it must have looked to those hordes of people who clambered off the boats with their children clinging. Now you've got verb, and then space, and then noun again. So it's probably a phrasal verb again, clinging them. Now you can think of this as a phrasal verb, or you can think of this as a verb and preposition. There's not really much difference here, but let's say it's just a verb and preposition. So which preposition depends on the verb cling? Which preposition must come after cling when you cling something? And if you know it, it's cling to something, okay? Cling to something, so clinging to them, to for number 10. So now we can come back to number 8, and here you can imagine that here really we want to say that anyone would reflect on how it must have looked to those hordes of people clambering off and clinging to them. Yeah, clambering off, notice the phrasal verb, clinging to, notice the phrasal verb, packed into, notice the phrasal verb. This is why I think it's useful for all of you to brush up on your phrasal verbs before you take this exam. So again, please do click on the link below where you'll be able to buy my book. But you can see that for number 8, really we're using a double negative here, impossible, not to reflect on, and we use this double negative to really emphasize how anyone and everyone would reflect on how it must have looked to those hordes of people. So it's impossible not to reflect on how it must have looked, and it just makes it even stronger. It's you're trying to emphasize how it must have looked. Okay, now we've got a space right at the start. Was only the poorest who had this experience. Now notice here that we've got something that's, if you're familiar with the video, again I've got a lesson on it. We've got something that is called a cleft sentence here. Now please type in cleft sentences Mr. Skype lessons if you don't know what I'm talking about. But a cleft sentence is where you split the sentence into two parts. It's like, it is an English lesson that I'm watching. I believe that's the example I use on the lesson. It is an English lesson that I'm watching instead of I am watching an English lesson. You cleave the sentence into two parts, and here we're doing the same. We've got blah 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 was only the poorest, and then the relative clause who had this experience. Okay, and so there's only a couple of words that could go here. Maybe it, maybe what, because there's a what cleft, although it's sometimes called a pseudo cleft. But you can use it or what or a couple of other words. All sometimes works. But we can see here that what doesn't work. It's only the word it that works. But if you know about cleft sentences, you will see this one straight away. It was only the poorest who had this experience. And then it's all great. It's, you could also say the poorest had this experience, and that wouldn't be a cleft. But this is a cleft sentence to emphasize it. It was only the poorest, the poorest in the land who had this experience. Okay? So it's an emphasis. First and second class passengers were dealt blah 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 by a far more civilized and expeditious system. Now this is passive, which is why you've got a by afterwards, but you've still got verb, and then it's probably a preposition here. And of course it is. It's another phrasal verb. So this is why I go on and on and on about phrasal verbs. You need to know them, guys. If you don't know your phrasal verbs, then you won't know a lot of the words that native speakers are using. So the phrasal verb with deal is deal with. You deal with somebody, and it means to sort somebody out, basically. And so these first and second class passengers were sorted out, were dealt with by a far more civilized and expeditious system. Then we've got 13 blah 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 that it was just third class and steerage travellers who had to through the Ellis Island application and sifting procedure. So let's come back to the first word here, 13. Now, this is a difficult one. We've got something that it was just third class and steerage travellers who had to through. Now, you can see you're looking for a verb here before the preposition. It's a phrasal verb again. You can see that preposition, then noun. You need a verb after had to. It's going to be in the infinitive because of the had to. And so think of some phrasal verbs with through. Now, there are two answers that work here. You could have pass through or go through the Ellis Island application and sifting procedure. Now, they're the two words on the answers, but I happen to know another one which doesn't sound too bad to me, although I must admit that it would be considered quite informal speech, and so perhaps it wouldn't work for that reason. That maybe that's why they don't include it on the answers. But I think even get through in informal English would be very natural. Some people had to get through this system, meaning get to the end of it and not just go through it, not just pass through it. So it does mean get through it successfully as well, and that might be another reason not to use it. But go or pass through work for number 14. Now, notice that we've got a comma after sifting procedure. Again, this is telling us that we've got an incomplete thought. We've got a subordinate clause. Now, that means that here it doesn't go straight on to subject and verb. It goes that, at the start, it goes something that, and then subject and verb. Now, this means you're going to need something like considering that, or seeing that, and they're the words which work for 13. You need considering that it was just third class and steerage passengers who had to pass through the Ellis Island application and sifting procedure. It is significant that, 40% of present-day Americans are descended. Now, you need to know the preposition that works with descend, and it's descend from. So, again, your prepositions and verbs are really necessary for this exam. They're very often testing prepositions, so learn your phrasal verbs, learn your dependent prepositions, and you will do better on this part. But considering or seeing for 13, and you can only really see that when you see that it's some kind of incomplete thought before the first comma down here. And that should make it a little bit easier to see that it's considering that, seeing that. If it were a by, it would be judging by or something like that. But judging by doesn't work here. So considering that, seeing that. Okay, I hope that's been useful to all of you. If you have any questions, please put them under the video. I will be doing some more exam lessons soon. And if anyone's interested in buying the book, please follow the link under the video. And if you have any problems buying it, please, by all means, do write under one of the videos and let me know about it. And I'll make sure you get your book straight away, because sometimes it goes into people's junk mail, and that's no problem. Just get in touch and I'll make sure you get it. If you've lost it in your junk mail or something, I'll always know that you've bought it anyway, and so I will ensure that you get that book. Okay, thanks everybody for watching. Please like, subscribe and all the rest of it, and I hope to see you all soon.